This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. If you're new to this channel, we chat about software architecture and design. Make sure to subscribe to get all our latest episodes. If you have a suggestion for a topic or a guest, make sure to let us know in the comments.
So yeah, I guess there's been a lot of talk about this Uber microservice thing that they wrote about. So we were just looking for the article that they had put up on their engineering blog, and it's 404. So I don't know. It's like they took it down. So I don't know if maybe so there was a lot of feedback. I don't want to say negative feedback. I think it's, it is what it is. But yeah, like you tweeted about it, I had tweeted about it, and so many others tweeted about it. Basically saying like it's like a mosaic of all these different concepts cobbled together in a way that you didn't really think through it. I personally think they maybe didn't think through it. I don't know to say think through it well. Like I understand different companies have different needs, but definitely they're talking about like SOA, domain-driven design, and stuff like that. And so at first glance, I skimmed through the article and I tweeted like, "Oh yeah, they're just doing like regular domain-driven design, where they're taking a bounded context and moving that into a microservice or whatever." But then I noticed other people were tweeting about it, like about specific details of once you zoom in some more into those smaller components, and it's actually not the case at all. Yeah, it's kind of weird to me. So, I mean, the way again, we don't have the article anymore, so it's hard to kind of go back. But from what I remember, it was basically like everything's a microservice. So you might have like in DDD terms, like a bounded context, basically some kind of boundary that's based on your domain, which might be like, I don't know, accounting or shipping or whatever, those kinds of things. But then within those, they would have like subcomponents, but then each of those components might have like a microservice that only handles UI, a microservice that handles data, a microservice that handles business logic. And from what I remember, it was like all direct HTTP. There was no like asynchronous messaging. So once I read into that, I was like, that's like 101. That's like distributed. I don't want to say distributed systems 101, but if you're going to do distributed systems and start doing microservices or DDD, that's kind of like one of the most, to me, like foundational things you need to get right. Is like, don't use RPC. Oh, like, yeah, RPC as a general rule, if you're doing RPC, like between like microservices or different applications, is potentially a sign that you've not designed your system properly. Not to say you can't use RPC ever. I think there's a healthy balance, there are use cases, but everywhere it's like, that's killer. Like I can't imagine what the performance of that would be like, or if it is performing well, what the cost of the hardware they're using is to keep that running. Like now you have to, I don't know, like it's just the overhead of like having to direct calls between microservices. Like that's kind of a known, it's like one of the first things, right? It's like one of the first things you learn is like, you don't do that. So yeah, I mean, we wanted to talk about this. They took the article down.
I don't know why. I don't know why it's not there. Who knows? Who knows why it's not there? I don't know if it's because of feedback or not, but yeah, weird that they took it down.
Yeah, who knows? But yeah, I mean, you had a comment that, it's RPC everywhere, and it's not really, yeah, it's going to cause problems, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's weird because they mentioned that that's how everything was communicating, yet they had in no direct paragraph, like actual written text, did they mention any messaging. But in one of the diagrams, they do show events, but they don't really mention it. They just mention, hey, we have all these services, like 2,000 something services that all communicate over RPC. And I don't know if that's HTTP, gRPC. I can't remember if they mentioned specifically.
Yeah.
Or maybe both. But the thing that I didn't really think of until recently, I was talking to Ian Cooper last week, and we were just having kind of a general discussion about stuff. And he mentioned this, and it makes a lot of sense to me now, is that you got to think about the evolution. Like, I mean, this is all speculation, what I'm about to say, but, and so never mind Uber, just think about any project that you've probably worked on, or even if you haven't, it could turn out this way, which is if you're starting something that obviously starts from nothing and it really grows and grows and grows, you in the development team grows and grows and grows, you have no choice but to get out of the monolith. Like they wrote that they had essentially, I think they said like they had 2 monoliths. And if and they said the exact reason, if you scale, you can't have that many developers trying to work on these 2 monoliths. It clearly wasn't working for them. Now this makes sense to me. Now, where do you think the next logical step would be? Clearly, it would be saying, hey, let's carve off this part of the monolith, but because everything was already communicating in process in that monolith before, we're just going to take that communication out of over the network. So if you had any interface or whatever it may be, some class that previously was just depending on some other class, that all that communication was done in process. Now it's, hey, let's turn that class, its implementation is actually going to go over the wire and hit the other class or whatever service, whatever it needs to do to fetch information or push information to it. So it's basically about like ripping things apart, but keeping that monolith is no longer a monolith in the sense of the code base is separated, but now you're doing communication over the wire. And this, like, that would seem like if you have a monolith and your team's growing at such a large rate, how else would you do it because if you're going to all of a sudden start messaging and you're going to start having separate databases and like that wouldn't be that step, you wouldn't have time to do that step.
Yeah.
So it seems like a logical transition, right? And then if you just keep going full tilt, yes, you end up with 2,000 microservices where everything is this tiny little service that's interacting with some other service. And then what they said the pain of it was in that article was then to try to troubleshoot something, you were dealing with a minimum of like 15 other services at any given point, which makes sense. So like, I think if you take the progression of probably where it started with 2 monoliths to having such a big development team and needing to separate all that and the path that went down with RPC, it kind of makes sense. It makes sense that that's how it turned out. Yeah,
that comes back to like trade-offs and all that. I can see, especially with Uber, because they, as far as I know, they have like fund, like investing or investors and that kind of thing going on. So yeah, politics and stuff comes into play too, right? Like, hey, we've got to do X, Y, Z by the end of the year, or else we're not going to get our next series of funding. So it's just like, what's going to be the fastest way that sort of works or works enough?
And that's the thing. If you're growing Uber didn't start that long ago, probably early 20, like after 2010. I don't know what the number was. I think it said in the article, but you're talking a relatively short time to have that many developers working on a project. I can get it now. I also just think that it was interesting that you go to this very far end of having all these services and it's like, then you realize, oh boy, this is complex. It's difficult to troubleshoot, etc. So now we start and then the cards start coming back a little bit, right? It's like, hey, now we're going to group all these services together, and then we're going to create a gateway or an entry point for those collections. So instead of being able to talk to any given service, from what I understood from that point when they were talking about the kind of that entry point, then it's like a collection of these services, right? That they're probably still between each other communicating via RPC. Yeah. But if you have like little bubbles here, right, you don't have like all these 2,000 services, kind of all of them available publicly. You have these kind of like these gateways that then are the kind of the entry point to all the little services within that. That's how I understood the kind of opening part of it, of what they were moving to.
Yeah.
But again, if you go with, if everything got split apart and everything went into, you know what I mean, like thousands of pieces, and it's like to try to tame it back down into whatever the number is that they ended up coming up at, it kind of starts making sense to me.
Yeah. Like the why definitely makes sense, but it's like, for me, it's still kind of scary knowing that my opinion is they've definitely went too far splitting things up. Because if you think of two monoliths, to take two monoliths and convert that into, I guess 2,000 services, that's a lot. So it's kind of like, well, what if you split it up into 20 pieces?
Yeah, I think it's just all relative to the number of developers.
Yeah.
Because it ultimately becomes like, it becomes an organizational thing. Like you blogged about this, it ends up becoming an organizational thing. So if you have that many developers, the number of services you're probably going to have are going to be relative to the number of teams that you have.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's it. Yeah, if you take 2,000 and say like 10 people per, 10 people per service, that's still 20,000. I don't know how many developers.
They might have like some people are dealing with a couple of them. That's when they kind of realize, hey, there's somewhat of a group of us that are dealing with like these 20 things. Yeah. That really could be one thing.
Yeah. In my mind, I think like if you have 10 developers is like the max. So two or three developers per service. I don't know what the average is for them, but that's 6,000 people. I don't know how much they have, but yeah. But like you said, if they double their staff in a year, that's fast, right? Like,
I think it's just easy to see that post and then think like, what in the heck? Because that's what I did initially.
I think the problem for most people is they're throwing in domain-driven design and SOA and picking little pieces from them, but not. People who like know DDD and SOA are like, no, like that is not at all what DDD. It's actually like the opposite of what DDD would suggest to do and what SOA would suggest to do. This, like SOA in particular, I'm thinking of how like business components or components in SOA, how one component manages the whole slice. So your UI and your data and your business logic, you don't separate that. I guess in a way, logically, maybe that works for them. I think what just scares me is they've split horizontally and vertically. I think that for me is the big concern. They've split vertically into different domains or features or whatever you want to call them. But then they've also split each of those individual things, like a microservice for the UI, a microservice for the data, a microservice for whatever. That I feel is maybe the biggest issue for me, other than the RPC everywhere, if that's the case, right?
Yeah, like I guess if I were to, like my mind's kind of shifted, like I said, from when I first read it, and I always kind of just go over and over again, understanding context. And they did now that I think about it, they did give the context of where they came from, right, with the monoliths and where they ended up at, and the reason why, like they described it. And what's interesting to me is I think about, my concern is that, like everything else in our world, is that people give, like, that was an experience report of the company of like how things have turned out. And good on them for posting it. Who knows why they took it down, but or maybe it moved, who knows, we haven't found it. But then at the same time, my fear a lot of times is people just see that and latch onto it. It's like, that's the next thing. And now we're doing whatever Uber's doing.
I think
right?
that's why a lot of people are so critical of that article in particular.
Yeah, but
because there's been so much of these big companies like Spotify, right? There's the Spotify like model of how you organize your teams and stuff, which apparently they didn't even do. It was just like a vision of what they thought might be a good idea. It actually didn't work, and so they moved on from it. But then you have companies who were trying that. I think, and with microservices, right? It's like, oh, let's just, exactly what you just said. I've had people contact me and say like, oh, we had this monolith and we split it up into microservices, and now everything's like, we're having performance issues because everything's just really chatty between each other. But that seems to happen a lot. There's maybe not so much now, but definitely, 2 years ago or so, it seemed like most content on microservices was kind of not that great. Great, in the sense of you're not doing it. It really comes into that chattiness, I think. You design your components to just be really coupled, and you're communicating over HTTP or RPC. Sorry, I cut you off there. You're going to say something.
No, I was just saying that I think it's like, with when I was mentioning like context and stuff like that, it just, I didn't think, like the gave context, I didn't really think much about it. I thought about, hey, you made up this thing and you're describing what this thing is, but that's okay, because that's where they are. Like that's their software isn't like other people's software. Their organization isn't. Like, it's, yes, there's people probably have similarities, but they are where they are because of how they've grown, the software's grown. They needed to make change to adapt to how they were growing. And it's to say like, oh, you need to fit this bill, you need to be following all these rules. It's like, that's like throwing that down, which what I was kind of doing. Is like, that's totally disregarding the context of how they actually operate. You know what I mean? It's like, there's so much more to it to just say, oh, well, you're not really doing this, you should be doing this. And it's like, well, yeah, that's all great. But like, think about any system I live in, like, there's an evolution of stuff. And it's just like, just to be at like this gold place, you know what I mean, where everything's great. It's like, that's not the reason why things aren't, is because things have changed and you've adapted the best you could.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I really hope they didn't take that down.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out.
And I think like I said, I think if they did, I suspect maybe it's because they used terms like domain-driven design and bounded context. But then when you see how they've done it, it's kind of, it's different. It's not really DDD. But anyways, that's that aside. It would be interesting to see, like you're saying, where they go in the future, like what issues they legitimately have. If they find they do have performance issues, what would concern me is if they just kind of add more abstractions, right? So you have all these little components inside the bubble, and you've got an API gateway on top. And I think there were actually other ways, like we don't have the article, so I'm just going from memory. But I remember there was like events. Somehow events were emitted, and it looked like it was RPC, but I don't remember.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. It was just in the diagram. It didn't really mention it.
So yeah, for me, I hope if I were in that situation, I definitely would not want to start adding more abstractions over all of this, because it's like, it's pretty complex as it is. But it'd be interesting to see where they go from there. And again, maybe maybe they'll solve some of these issues with better hardware or on-demand computing. If you have individual services that you need to scale.
Yeah,
you
they
can do
didn't
that.
really, they didn't really, I don't think they didn't really touch on that. What I'll try to do is I'll either try to find the original post if it landed somewhere, or a copy of it archived somewhere, and I'll include it in the description. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.